The absolute silence was the first thing that hit him, a silence that tasted wrong, thick with the metallic aftertaste of ozone and a deep, dizzying panic. David Rourke slammed his fist against the steering wheel of his rig, a beat-up 1979 Peterbilt, and a sharp pain barely registered above the roaring emptiness in his head. Monday. He was absolutely sure it was Monday when he pulled over near mile marker 43 on US 93, just north of Alamo, Nevada. He needed maybe 30 minutes of shut-eye before the long haul across the Mojave. The clock on the dash, the old analog clock he always kept set because the digital one was unreliable, was blinking wildly, cycling through 12 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 12 o'clock. But the sun was blazing high, a cruel, indifferent midday furnace. He fumbled for his CB radio, the static crackling like dry leaves underfoot, and managed to catch a faint, distant snippet of news radio out of Kingman. The anchor's voice, dull and reassuringly normal, dropped a date that made the blood freeze in his veins and the desert air feel suddenly frigid. Thursday, October 13th, 1983. Thursday, not Monday. 72 hours, 3 full days, had simply vanished from the face of the earth, wiped clean from his consciousness, leaving behind nothing but a throbbing pressure behind his eyes and the unsettling, cold certainty that he had not been sleeping. He looked down at his hands, grime etched deep into the knuckles from weeks on the road, but something was off. His wristwatch, a reliable Seiko he never took off, was gone. More disturbingly, the heavy flannel shirt he remembered wearing, the red and black plaid, was replaced by a thin, ill-fitting, pristine white cotton undershirt he didn't recognize, and it felt too tight across his chest, almost surgical. His truck, the behemoth he knew intimately, was parked not on the dirt-shouldered 93, but tucked awkwardly behind a derelict gas station 70 miles west, outside of Barstow, California. 400 miles from where he last consciously stopped. His logbook lay open on the passenger's seat, showing Monday's mileage complete, signed off, but the subsequent pages, Tuesday and Wednesday, were completely blank, save for a single, faint, shaky pencil mark resembling an inverted crescent moon drawn right in the middle of the remarks section for Tuesday. David felt the sheer, unbelievable scale of the time displacement wash over him, suffocating him with an impossibility that screamed louder than any engine. He checked the fuel tanks, expecting them to be low, expecting the truck to have been driven hard, but the gauges showed near full, contradicting the physical distance traveled. It was as if the truck and he had been lifted, transported, and meticulously replaced. The cold, logical part of his trucker brain, the part that dealt in mileage, weight, and physics, was screaming mechanical impossibility, while the primal part of his brain was already whispering a far more terrifying truth, a truth wrapped in the silent, starless void of those missing 72 hours. The drive back to his small home outside Flagstaff was a blur of paranoid speed and crippling migraine. Every passing car seemed to slow down. Every distant airplane seemed to track him. He arrived home late Thursday night, expecting panic, perhaps police, certainly frantic calls from his wife, Susan. Instead, Susan was asleep, the house quiet, the TV murmuring in the living room. It wasn't until he woke her, shaking slightly, that the true weight of the concealment began to settle. Susan, a pragmatic woman who worked 2 jobs and believed only in what she could touch, hadn't reported him missing. He explained, stammering, the Monday to Thursday jump, the Barstow location, the empty hours. She looked at him with a mixture of fear and profound confusion. She said he had called late Tuesday afternoon, sounding tired, mentioning a broken clutch plate outside Bakersfield, saying he might be delayed a couple of days waiting for parts. He even described, in detail, the mechanic's shop, the price of the parts, and the dusty diner across the street. Details David had never experienced, never seen. This was the first layer of the erasure. Not just a gap in his memory, but an implanted, functional memory used to placate the outside world. He immediately called the payphone number Susan swore he had given her. It rang unanswered. A dusty diner in a town he had never been to, verified by a quick call to information. The following morning, the police arrived. David hadn't called them, but Susan, terrified by his wild-eyed state and the impossible story, had cautiously notified a friend on the force. They treated him with wary suspicion, filing a perfunctory missing persons report, mostly focused on the potential liability of an interstate trucker exhibiting signs of disorientation or drug use. It was then, standing under the harsh glare of the garage floodlight while a bored officer checked the truck's cab, that David noticed the physical anomalies. On the back of his neck, right where the hairline met the skin, there were 3 tiny puncture marks, spaced perfectly in an equilateral triangle. They were healing, almost gone, but distinct. On the engine block of the Peterbilt, near the battery housing, a part of the truck that never got excessively hot, was a section of the steel that had been cleanly scorched white, almost fused, as if subjected to intense, focused heat. The officer dismissed the marks as bug bites and the scorch as an electrical short, but David knew better. He knew they were evidence of a truth too big, too cold, and too efficiently covered up for ordinary human institutions to comprehend or confront. The fear solidified into a paralyzing knowledge. Something had taken him, used him, and then placed him back, leaving behind only the ghosts of manipulation. The fear quickly mutated into a driving, relentless obsession. David couldn't return to the road. The thought of being alone again, miles from civilization, was unbearable, but the constant presence of Susan, with her worried glances and careful attempts at normalcy, was equally suffocating. He spent the next month systematically mapping the 72 hours. He tracked the mileage discrepancy, the exact point he remembered stopping on Monday, mile 43, US 93, and the point he found himself on Thursday, Barstow, California. The 400 miles were impossible for a standard tow, and the fuel consumption was too low for him to have driven it, let alone driven it while unconscious. His search broadened. He wasn't looking for truck stops or misturns. He was looking for anomalies. He visited the library. No internet in 1983. Only microfiche and dusty newspaper archives. He searched regional papers along the US 93 corridor, looking for anything strange between October 10th and 13th. He found small, isolated reports. A rancher near Caliente claimed his entire herd of goats disappeared overnight without breaking the perimeter fence. A family camping near Beatty reported a massive, silent, pulsing light that hovered over their campsite for an hour, causing their generator to fail and their dog to whimper in terror for days afterwards. Individually, these stories were dismissed as eccentric desert tales, but triangulated with his own missing time, they formed a terrible constellation of localized strangeness, all centered around that desolate stretch of Nevada desert. The physiological symptoms worsened. The persistent migraine never fully subsided, replacing itself with a dull, throbbing pressure that felt like static behind his frontal lobe. His light sensitivity became debilitating, forcing him to wear dark glasses even inside the house. And then there was the hum. It was a low-frequency, almost subaudible resonance that he began to hear late at night, a sound like a distant, massive tuning fork vibrating in the deepest reaches of space. Susan heard nothing. David found himself staring into the darkness, straining to hear the hum, sometimes convinced it wasn't a sound at all, but vibration fell directly in his bones, a lingering frequency imprint left by whatever vessel had carried him across time and space. He knew the police considered him unstable, and Susan was dangerously close to agreeing with them, suggesting therapists who specialized in acute stress and delusions. But David knew he wasn't delusional. The evidence was physical, if subtle. The engine scorch, the symmetrical puncture wounds, the impossible geometry of the missing days. He started sleeping with the logbook open on his chest, the faint, inverted crescent drawing a haunting silhouette under the moonlight filtering through the bedroom window. He felt singled out, watched, but most profoundly, he felt contaminated. The silence of those 72 hours wasn't empty. It was filled with something profoundly alien, something waiting to resurface. Driven by the absolute necessity to retrieve the truth hidden behind the humming veil, David finally conceded that conventional therapy, was useless. He needed a specialist in the unconventional, someone who understood the architecture of impossible trauma. Through a network of fringe researchers, obscure newsletters circulated through post office boxes, and long-distance calls to strange numbers listed in the back of metaphysical magazines, he found Dr. Elias Thorne. Thorne was based in a discreet office complex outside of Tucson, Arizona, and specialized in dissociative fugue states and memory anomalies tied to unusual phenomena. David drove down in his Ford pickup, leaving the Peterbilt parked and silent, a monument to his fractured life. Dr. Thorne was not the wild-eyed zealot David half expected. He was a man in his late 50s, meticulously dressed in tweed, possessing a quiet, analytical demeanor and eyes that seemed perpetually tired, as if they had witnessed too many horrors delivered in bland clinical language. Thorne didn't immediately buy the alien narrative, but he respected the data. He spent 2 full sessions meticulously reviewing David's physical evidence. The police reports, the engine-scorched photos, which he acknowledged defied easy explanation, the location discrepancy, and most importantly, the 3 triangular puncture marks, which Thorne photographed using a high-resolution lens. Thorne noted that the marks were perfectly aligned and equidistant, suggesting an instrument rather than a natural cause. "Mr. Rourke," Thorne said, his voice level, "I deal in memory retrieval, not UFOs. But the narrative you present, coupled with these physical incongruities, suggests an extreme, high-stress, dissociative event. Whether the catalyst was mundane human violence or something beyond, the method to unlock the sealed compartments of your mind remains the same: regression hypnosis. We're going to treat the missing 72 hours as a form of elaborate psychological amnesia, a defense mechanism against an overwhelming trauma." David felt a flicker of hope tempered by the dread of what might be lurking in the darkness. Thorne warned him about the risks: false memories, suggestion, the possibility of permanent psychological scarring. But David was already scarred. The lack of knowledge was the wound that wouldn't heal. He needed to know what had worn his clothes, spoken his words, and driven his truck across state lines while he was functionally absent. The preparation was intense. Fasting, relaxation techniques, and detailed briefings on the difference between genuine recall and confabulation. As he lay on the plush leather couch in the dim, soundproofed room for his first session, the persistent hum in his head seemed to amplify, rising slightly in pitch, a signal trying desperately to break through the internal jamming. Dr. Thorne's voice was a low, steady anchor, guiding David deeper and deeper away from the immediate fear and back into the cold desert night of October 10th. The scent of ozone and diesel faded, replaced by the heavy, dry smell of creosote and dust. He was back at mile marker 43, the Peterbilt rumbling softly, the stars immense and indifferent above the dark spine of the mountains. Thorne instructed him to focus only on the last thing he saw, the last sensation before the void. The memory fought back savagely, manifesting as a sudden, crippling muscle spasm in his jaw, a reflexive tightening against an unknown intrusion. Then it broke, not a gentle fade, but a blinding, instantaneous eruption of light. It wasn't headlights. It was too wide, too silent, encompassing the entire dome of the sky. The light was pale white, pulsing subtly, and it didn't cast shadows. It seemed to absorb them, creating a flat, terrifying landscape where depth and perspective vanished. David's breathing hitched violently on the couch. He choked out the word, "Frozen. I can't move." Thorne gently pressed him forward. David described the sensation of absolute paralysis, not mechanical, but neurological. His brain was functioning, screaming danger, but the command pathways to his limbs were severed. He could only stare up through the windscreen as the source of the light descended. It was massive, silent, and geometric, not the classic saucer shape, but a wide, flattened, charcoal black triangle that blocked out the stars. It hovered directly above the cab, causing the air to vibrate with an incredible subsonic force that rattled his teeth. The humming in his head suddenly exploded into agonizing clarity. It wasn't a memory. It was the sound of the vessel itself, vibrating at a frequency designed to incapacitate living tissue. Then, an intense, focused beam of blue-white light slammed down, enveloping the Peterbilt. It was like falling into water that wasn't wet, a feeling of being pulled upward with impossible speed. The last coherent thought David had before the memory slammed shut was the chilling realization that the beings who controlled this technology did not use brute force. They used physics to achieve absolute, silent control. They hadn't forced the truck open. They simply lifted the consciousness right out of him. The transition was too fast, too efficient, too terrifyingly clean. The session ended abruptly, David coming up gasping, covered in a cold sweat, his face pale white. The memory had been retrieved, but the journey had only just begun. The true horror wasn't the light or the paralysis. It was the clinical, absolute efficiency of the capture. When we think of alien contact, we often imagine communication or conflict. But what if their methods are purely scientific, treating us like biological specimens to be acquired and cataloged without ceremony or concern for our terror? What if the greatest danger lies not in malicious intent, but in pure, unfeeling indifference? That is the terrifying question David Rourke faced in the sterile quiet of Dr. Thorne's office. And it is a question I urge you, the viewer, to consider as well. If you have ever felt that cold touch of the unknown, that profound sense of being utterly helpless in the face of an incomprehensible force, please share your thoughts on the nature of their intentions in the comments below. Do you think indifference is worse than malice? The subsequent regression sessions delved past the initial paralysis and into the overwhelming, disorienting experience of the ascent. David described an unnerving feeling of weightlessness combined with immense pressure, as if he were squeezed through an invisible sieve. The blue-white light dissolved, and he found himself lying horizontally, seemingly floating along a narrow, brilliantly illuminated corridor. The environment inside the craft was sterile and confounding. The walls were not metal, but appeared to be composed of a dense, pearlescent material that absorbed all noise and reflection. There were no visible seams, no rivets, no traditional indicators of engineering or assembly. The structure felt grown, organic, yet perfectly polished. The air was cold, dry, and carried that persistent, faint scent of ozone and burnt metal. It felt entirely unnatural, a space utterly divorced from earthly atmosphere. David remembered trying desperately to orient himself. His paralysis was gone, replaced by a heavy, chemical lethargy. He could move, but only with monumental effort, like pushing through thick syrup. He became aware of others, not companions, but others who had been captured. Lying in adjacent alcoves were forms, dark shapes that he couldn't quite focus on. They were silent, equally inert, suggesting they too were under the influence of whatever substance or field permeated the ship. The corridor twisted, yet the turns were smooth, frictionless, navigated not by moving his body, but by the movement of the platform he was lying on. He realized he wasn't floating. He was on a perfectly tailored, low-slung transport slab, gliding silently through the interior landscape of the massive triangular vessel. The architecture was terrifyingly rational. Everything served a function, devoid of any decoration or waste. The illumination came not from light fixtures, but from the walls themselves, a cool, constant glow that provided no shadows, eliminating the natural hiding places of the human eye. This relentless, shadowless light was designed, David instinctively understood, to maximize visibility for the examiners, while minimizing comfort and orientation for the specimen. As the slab finally stopped, he was positioned beneath a gigantic, low archway leading into a vast hemispherical chamber. The sheer scale of the space suggested a hangar, but it was pristine, empty save for several examination stations spread out across the glassy floor. He could hear, now, a faint clicking sound, precise and rhythmic, like specialized instruments being prepared. He was about to come face to face with the engineers of his terror, and the profound coldness of the ship's interior was nothing compared to the chilling emptiness he felt anticipating their approach. The hemispherical chamber was the operating theater of the gods. As David's memory crystallized, the full scale of the encounter snapped into horrifying focus. The entities appeared. They moved with a disturbing, fluid efficiency, seeming to glide rather than walk, their movements synchronized and silent. They were the classic figures that would later haunt popular imagination. Tall, unnervingly thin, with disproportionately large, bulbous heads and huge, liquid black eyes that reflected the relentless white light, giving them an ancient, submerged appearance. They wore silvery gray, form-fitting garments that offered no discernible seams or openings, suggesting they were perhaps integrated with the suits, or that the suits were grown rather than manufactured. David, struggling to lift his head on the examination slab, registered the profound lack of humanity. These were not monsters driven by anger or sadism. They were clinical professionals driven by an alien imperative. Their faces were featureless, lacking mouth, nose, or ear structures recognizable to human anatomy, save for the large, impenetrable eyes which seemed to swallow all light and emotion. David tried to scream, but the air felt too thick, his vocal cords paralyzed, emitting only a strained, pathetic wheezing sound. One of the beings stood directly over him, its head tilted slightly, an unnerving gesture that conveyed not curiosity, but cold calculation. David described the hands. Long, spindly, with 4 slender digits, moving with incredible dexterity and purpose. This was the moment of absolute, complete surrender. David realized that to these entities he was not a person, not a prisoner, but a research subject, a biological puzzle whose distress was irrelevant to the successful completion of the experiment. The examination began immediately. A long, thin instrument, tipped with a pulsing red light, was inserted into his nasal cavity with excruciating, silent precision. The pain was sharp, intense, but the chemical lethargy kept him from thrashing. He felt the instrument scrape deep inside his sinuses, followed by a sudden, intense pressure behind his left eye. Then, another entity approached his feet. They affixed restraints that appeared to be made of solidified light rather than metal straps, tightening around his ankles and wrists without causing bruising. The most invasive part was the chest area. A clear, dome-shaped device was lowered onto his sternum, emitting a dull, electrical current that seemed to resonate with the existing hum in the room. He felt an agonizing pressure beneath his ribs, a sensation of something being probed or extracted from his internal organs. Throughout the entire process, the beings communicated, but not with audible sound. David registered a cacophony of thoughts, sharp, rapid, and entirely inhuman, buzzing directly inside his mind, a torrent of data acquisition and functional commands that bypassed his ears entirely. He understood nothing of the content, but the sheer coldness of their collective purpose was devastatingly clear. They were cataloging the fragility of the human organism, and his terror was just another data point. The process of memory erasure, according to Dr. Thorne's framework, is rarely absolute. It is often a layered psychological block, a firewall installed by the abductors to ensure the subject functions normally upon return, thus maintaining the secrecy of their operations. David Rourke's regression reached the point of the procedure, and the memories became choppy, distorted, overlaid with bursts of static and blinding white noise, the telltale sign of intentional psychological interference. The beings, having completed their physical measurements and implantations, turned their attention to the control center of the mind. David felt a strange, cold presence near his head. An instrument, resembling a sleek, curved helmet crafted from the same pearlescent material as the walls, was gently lowered over his skull. As the device settled, the humming frequency in the room shifted, spiking sharply into a high-pitched, almost painful whine. David's internal monologue, the last bastion of his identity, became a desperate, panic scream. He watched, internally, as colors bled, shapes distorted, and coherent thought began to unravel. The The memory block wasn't a loss of information, but a rearrangement of reality. He described seeing images flashing across his mind's eye. Images of Susan, his truck, mundane road signs, all being methodically disconnected from their correct emotional and temporal anchors. They were constructing the alibi for the 72 hours, building the narrative of the broken clutch plate and the Bakersfield mechanic, brick by terrifying brick. David fought back with every ounce of his remaining consciousness, clinging desperately to one single, insignificant detail, one piece of data that the entities might overlook. He found it: the shape of the chamber ceiling, the way the light refracted off the curved plating at a specific angle, creating a small, pulsing violet spark near the apex. He focused on that spark, driving it deep into the primitive regions of his brain. He knew the entities were experts at erasing human context, but perhaps not at erasing pure, meaningless geometry. The effort was crippling. As the memory-altering field intensified, David felt a profound psychic violation, an invasion that bypassed pain and went straight for the soul. He felt the exact moment the command was installed. Forget the light. Forget the shape. You were in Bakersfield. The beings moved with such swift finality, sealing the vault of his recent experience. The surgical precision they applied to his body was nothing compared to the psychological ruthlessness of the wipe. He realized that the 3 puncture marks on his neck were likely associated not with the physical exam, but with the delivery of the chemicals or frequencies necessary to facilitate this total psychological erasure. His 72 hours of existence had been reduced to an empty, sterile vessel, ready to be refilled with a false, functional reality. The end of the procedure was as abrupt and cold as the beginning. The helmet was lifted, the high-pitched whine ceased, and the chemical lethargy lifted slightly, leaving behind a feeling of extreme exhaustion and a lingering taste of metallic dust. David was no longer interesting to them. The entities, without a backward glance or a moment of hesitation, began preparing the station for the next specimen. One of the dark shapes he had glimpsed earlier was already being maneuvered onto a nearby slab. He was simply surplus, a discarded container. The transport slab began to glide silently backward, retracing the path through the pearlescent corridors. The feeling of being dumped was palpable. There was no gentle release, no calming transition. The last impression David had of the interior of the craft was the terrifying scale of its operation. He briefly caught sight of a vast, lower level filled with what looked like thousands of similar transport slabs, all moving with the same silent, inevitable purpose, suggesting that he was far from a unique subject. He was part of a terrifyingly efficient harvest. The return to the world felt like falling into a muddy, chaotic pit after existing in a clean, airless void. The intense blue-white light slammed down again, not paralyzing this time, but disorienting, and then darkness. He didn't remember the descent or the placement of a truck. He simply returned to consciousness, sprawled across the driver's seat outside Barstow, the engine silent, the sun high, and the impossible weight of 3 missing days settling upon him like a shroud. But the fight to retain that one sliver of truth, the geometric spark, had paid a strange dividend. Alongside the false memory of Bakersfield, a strange, abstract image remained burned into his mind's eye, a series of interlocking symbols, complex and non-Euclidean, which he recognized instantly as part of the operational display he had glimpsed briefly during the procedure, perhaps a status report or a navigation key. It was meaningless, yet profoundly true. It wasn't human. It was the artifact he had fought to bring back, a cold, hard piece of undeniable reality amidst the constructed fantasy. He realized the incredible price of this truth. The recovery sessions with Dr. Thorne were not painless. They were a grueling re-traumatization. He was forcing his brain to break the psychological restraints imposed by a technologically superior intelligence. Every fragmented memory brought with it debilitating physical symptoms: nosebleeds, temporary vision loss, and agonizing, localized pain where the instruments had been inserted. But the image of the symbols, that tiny victory, kept him going. He had been used, but he had taken a souvenir, a cold, metallic shard of their world lodged permanently in the warm chaos of his own. The journey of David Rourke did not end on Dr. Thorne's couch. It began there. The retrieval of the 72 hours brought profound emotional devastation, but it also brought undeniable certainty. He knew, intimately, what had happened, and more importantly, who had done it. He knew the cold, geometric reality of the Greys and the terrifying scale of their continuous, silent operations in the deserted corridors of the American West. He never drove the Peterbilt again. It sat rusting in the yard, a heavy, silent testament to the moment physics failed him. Susan, overwhelmed by the intensity of his retrieved memories and the resulting emotional instability, eventually sought separation, unable to distinguish between genuine trauma and the delusion society insisted upon. David understood. The truth he carried was too heavy for shared reality. He moved further into the fringes, working odd jobs that required minimal interaction, dedicating his spare time to documenting and sketching the symbols he had retained, trying to find a pattern, a key, anything that made sense of the alien script. The psychological cost remained immense. The permanent, low-frequency hum was now his constant companion, sometimes swelling in intensity, prompting profound panic attacks that convinced him they were tracking him, listening, perhaps preparing for a return visit. The paranoia was rooted in experience, not fantasy. Dr. Thorne continued to work with him, collecting David's testimony and comparing it to other, highly fragmented accounts from the 1980s, finding terrifying correlations in the surgical marks, the ozone smell, and the geometric layout of the ships. David realized that his story wasn't just a personal ordeal. It was a chapter in a vast, clandestine operational log, a continuous thread running beneath the surface of American life, ignored by the mainstream, but acutely felt by those who had been touched. He started to connect with other survivors, people who also carried the invisible scars of lost time, forming a quiet, fearful fraternity bound by shared, unbelievable experience. He never achieved resolution or peace, only clarity. He knew that the empty spaces on the map, the isolated highways, and the vast, ignored deserts were not empty at all. They were their staging grounds, the zones of operation where the silent fleet moved with impunity. The biggest tragedy was not the physical violation, but the realization that the secrecy was enforced not only by the technology of the beings, but by the societal ridicule and denial built into our own culture. David Rourke lives today, not as a victim, but as a reluctant custodian of a secret too immense for the world to handle, constantly vigilant for the return of the light that shattered his life in 1983.